Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, here to talk to you about the Corsair 2500D and more importantly, mistakes that I made while building in it, because I want to highlight some errors I made, some small ones and some bigger ones that you should probably consider before you buy and before you build in it. That will make your life a little bit easier. A variety of things in all sorts of ways, and this is actually quite a complicated case to build in theory, or maybe not, depending on how you do it and what you use. So it might be quite specific, and there are some fun highlights around it. So one of them, for example, is I side mounted some fans onto the case, and while doing that I realized that I had basically focused on getting the cables in the right direction. So I wanted to put the cables towards the top and bottom, point them towards the rear, make the most of the cable loops up there to make it nice and neat. I ended up basically putting them so that the logos faced in different directions. Not a problem for airflow, just for aesthetic reasons it looks a bit silly, so something to think about is not just focusing on that. Now I also managed to mount the front fans on the wrong side of the tray, so I put them on the inside instead of the outside, which then meant they stuck out inside the tray and then potentially look horrible or interfere with other things in there. For the front fans, you mount them on the outside. Now, one of the things to keep in mind there is you do need to take care the front mesh panel actually has a bit of mesh inside it, which if it gets sort of interfered with too much, that actually sticks up against the fans and causes a bit of noise. So that wasn't really a mistake of mine, but it is something to bear in mind that over time that might cause a problem. So if you notice that your front fans are causing a lot of noise, it's probably that inner mesh on that panel, so that's something to watch out for. The other mistake that I made is I went to use a Mini-ITX motherboard on this, so a small, tiny little motherboard, which the case is capable of taking, but it does look pretty daft in there. It looks quite small, and there's a lot of space surrounding it. Now, actually, once you've got your graphics card in there and all the fans and everything else, it doesn't look too bad. But the downside to this is there's a lot of space around the motherboard tray where a lot of cables come from the rear. Obviously, your power supply cables, your front top panel connectors, fan connectors, whatever else you're using. Those all sorts of come from the rear, and they just look messy because there's multiple sort of gaps in the case to run these cables through. I also made the mistake of using a small form factor power supply unit at this point, and those cables basically are a bit short, which meant running them from the rear to the front was a bit difficult and quite tight. This highlighted a problem where you have to remove the hard disk drive cage from the rear of the case in order to run those cables through to the front. So that's one particular issue that's worth bearing in mind as well. But what I found was those cables are a little bit short, which is potentially problematic. Now, you have the option of small form factor or full-size ATX power supply unit in this case. The benefit of using the full size is obviously you can get more of them. There's a lot more varied wattage uses for the power supply unit, so you can get higher wattage power supplies in the ATX format than you can in a small form factor, generally speaking. So it makes it a bit more flexible in that way, which means if you're putting a pretty powerful system into the 2500D, you can still make good use of a full-size power supply and obviously the longer cables that come with that. So what I'd recommend if you're opting for the smaller motherboard is actually to get a big full-size standard power supply unit, because the cables will be longer. And if you're using the small form factor power supply, I'd actually recommend going with a back connect motherboard. So I've got the MSI Project Zero motherboard that actually has some rear power cables on it. So all the connectors for it are on the back. That includes everything from the CPU fan header to the system fan headers to the EPS power connectors for the CPU, 24-pin motherboard power cable, and all sorts of other things. They all connect at the rear. And this is actually the better option for the case in my mind, is a non-standard M-ATX motherboard. You could get an M-ATX motherboard, a normal one that would fit too, but the rear connect ones are actually better in this instance because the case is basically designed for them so that the cables protrude into the rear, which means that you can really tidy things up nicely. If you use a small form factor with that, that means you've got shorter cables and you don't have to worry quite so much about cable management. My cable management is a bit of a joke, and it's kind of consistently that. And I do it on purpose, actually, because I like to demonstrate sort of how messy you can get with cases and still be able to close the rear panel. And it's like a test for me personally. If I can't close the rear panel, then obviously that case isn't great. And also my cable management isn't great, but that's fine. But with this case, you do need to worry about the cable management a little bit more, especially if you're using a rear connect motherboard. So having shorter cables is actually beneficial with the right motherboard. So it's about getting the right part combo, and I think that's important to keep in mind. The other thing I tried to do is I tried to do a push-pull setup on the fan tray, which is putting radiator on it and then fans on one side and then fans on the other side. But what I found is because my radiator's a bit thick and the fans are a bit thick, they actually press up against the front fans, so the front fan tray of the case. So you can't actually do it. You can't actually do a push-pull because you can't put that radiator in the inner position. And the reason for that is Lee's fans that I'm using on that radiator are slightly thicker than your standard fans, which means they press up against that fan tray. And therefore you can't do a push-pull setup, and you potentially can't front mount that radiator. Now this is my mistake, but it also highlights another one which is important, which is basically pay attention to the configuration of what you're buying and whether it will work in the first place, which is why it's useful to subscribe to me, because you'll see information like this that you might not be aware of otherwise. It's hard to know all the different configuration options just based on a spec sheet. In my experience, it will tell you can do one thing when in reality you can actually do something else, or you might not be able to do this. So yes, it looks like you can do push-pull in there, but I unfortunately wasn't able to test it because the radiator is too thick. But if I was using a Corsair radiator, a 240mm cooler, and standard thickness fans, it might well have been able to do it. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to test that, but the point is, just watch out for those configuration things and think about that when installing it. Now, I've done a couple of different builds in this case, with the top-mounted 360mm all-in-one cooler and a side-mounted 240mm. I'm also going to do an air tower at some point soon as well, so for a few different build variations in there. But hopefully these sort of tips will be helpful to you to watch out for these mistakes. See if you can spy any others and point them out in the comments down below. I'm sure people will have plenty of criticisms, and that's perfectly fine. And then if you enjoyed this or found it useful, insightful, go and check out my review on the case, because I go into a lot more depth on all the different things here and all the different problems that you might encounter. But also, it's a pretty fantastic case in a number of ways. Really good build quality, compact, good airflow, nice design, upgradability is nice, and the modularity of it and the way you can install things in different ways is also pretty cool. So not a bad case. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.